The next man I'm about to introduce hails, his heritage is of the Métis people. Born in Edmonton in Alberta. Not really knowing David myself, I put my husband, who is a Canadian, also born and raised in Alberta, to work. And I got him to get on his Facebook page and ask all of his friends in Canada, who is this man I'm going to be introducing? And much like the wave of love that I received from my friends around the world for Moana, we were inundated by messages of love for David and the work that he's done as well. So I also did my homework, because that's what you do when you're introducing people. You get online and you go to Auntie Google and you punch in somebody's name. And the myriad of articles that came up that you had written were fascinating reads at 10:30 last night after trying to put a very rambunctious daughter to bed. And what I respect is that you not only challenge Western ideologies and Western concepts and their ability to tell Indigenous story, I also enjoyed your challenge to Indigenous peoples around how we tell our own stories and what we hold as our true stories, and how we might want to dig a little bit under some of those stories to reveal another true Indigenous self. I've really respected your writings on those topics, and gives me food for thought in terms of how I engage in ceremony and the prominence I give to ceremony. So I'm really intrigued and fascinated to hear the kōrero that he's going to deliver us today. So without further ado, please, a round of applause.
Oops, I went too far. Tēnā koutou keto, Tanchi Kayan Maten, Dishikanshan David Garneau, Nimiyu Métis Oshish, Treaty 4, Turtle Island. I acknowledge the ancestors, elders, knowledge keepers, and cultural producers of this remarkable place. I am a grateful guest. I recognize the sovereignty of the Maori and the treaty that maintains the peace. I bring greetings and offer respect from Treaty 4 territory of Turtle Island, home of the Neheiwak, the Nahakininiwak, and the Métis, my nation. Thank you, Philippa and Alex as well, Museums Australia and Aotearoa for the invitation and your hospitality. Thank you to the organizers, funders, service staff, and volunteers for making this extraordinary gathering possible. I'm honored to be here. And you won't believe this, but I'm giving the same talk, but a Canadian version. I'm going to be talking about rocks and names. Unbelievable. So I come from Turtle Island. This is a map that shows some of the Indigenous occupations, different territories. The Métis aren't on there, we don't really count. Prairie provinces, so we're in the middle of the country now known as Canada. So I grew up and have lived nearly all of my life on the Great Plains of the country known as Canada. And while my observations and thoughts arise from my locale, I hope they resonate with your various locals. And if you feel alienated by something I say, which is likely, let's just call it a cultural misunderstanding. This is my street, and it's warmer right now. We're going into our spring. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Royal Alberta Museum. So my father, Richard Garneau, loved history and science and often took us as 5 kids to museums. In 1972, when I was 10, an unusual object appeared near the entrance of the Royal Alberta Museum. We marveled and ran fingers over its undulant surface. Appearing to be a 145-kilogram slab of hammered iron, the enigmatic form was actually not human-made, but a 4.5 billion-year-old meteorite. Visiting often, it was free back then, I always stole a touch from this sublime entity, reached for the stars, and considered my fleeting existence. At first he was excited, and then my dad's face flared, then darkened in recognition. He said that the thing was not what it seemed. Yes, it was what it was, but it was also something else. A Métis historian and genealogist, he recognized that this was Pampamiha Asini, the Manitu Stone. Sacred to the Dene, Cree, Blackfoot, and Métis. To have it in a museum and is classified as a geological specimen was not just an error, but a provocation to Aboriginal people. And it worked. He was upset. Legal scholar, there's so many symmetries, I can't believe it. Legal scholar and philosopher Leroy Littlebear explains that in the Blackfoot worldview, everything from rotating galaxies to vibrating atoms is in motion, animated. Plains people have a respect for rocks called grandfathers, he says, because while everything is in flux, time and motion relative, these relatives are the most stable, less mutable than, say, plants, animals, and people. You can imagine the significance then of a grandfather this old and who descended from the stars. The full meaning and the use of the Manitu Stone is not mine to share, but it was common knowledge to those in the region prior to the mid-19th century that if looked at from the right angle, you can see the face of the Creator. And any Aboriginal person who trekked near paid it homage. And a prophecy claimed that if something were to happen to the stone, disaster would befall First Nations, the territory's First Nations. Knowing its importance, sometime in the 1860s, George MacDougall, a Methodist minister, abducted the stone, and calamity ensued. The railroad, waves of smallpox, settlers, alcohol, wage labor, and the cash economy all swept in. The bison, the center of Plains livelihood and spirituality, were hunted to near extinction. Then came the Northwest resistances, the military invasions, hangings, land dispossession, internment on reserves, the pass system, colonial law, disproportionate incarceration, dishonored treaties, legislated starvation, bans on ceremony and regalia, Indian residential schools, adopting out of children to white families, the relentless campaign to annihilate the language, cultures, sovereignty, and bodies of First Peoples. To Freud, civilization is sublimation. Our civilizing institutions, such as Indian residential schools, churches, and museums, the Aboriginal was raw material needing refinement, to be made less coarse, more socially acceptable. But as we become increasingly discontent with civilization, that is the patriarchal, racist, capitalist version which is ill-suited to most people and devastating to all ecosystems, and come to recognize that Indigenous ways of knowing and being offer a more holistic civility, museums struggle to free themselves from their colonial carapace and cautiously approach indigeneity. That's the end of my pause. Among the ways museums sublimate First Nations was by collecting their most beautiful and interesting things, freeze-drying and editing them. The colonial curators cured, they made cultural preserves. They exhibited a select, authentic, and dead Indianness in order to delegitimize and eventually repress the possibility of contemporary indigeneity. The colonial purpose of displays of First Nations glory prior to catastrophic contact was first, to establish settlement as total, and second, to demonstrate that survivors are not what they once were. The implied story goes, diluted by European blood, and especially by modernity, Indians are not really Aboriginal anymore, and unreal Aboriginals are not really entitled to treaty land and sovereignty. Not quite Aboriginals are just another minority group, more colored tiles in our cultural mosaic. Colonialism always comes back to land, the conversion of native territory into settler property. For decorum's sake, the shift from imperialism to settler colonialism necessitated finer forms of state violence. Outright murder, internment, and starvation were out of vogue by the 20th century. More discreet forms of aggressive assimilation were needed so as not to upset the finer settlers as they went about their fine settling. Indian residential schools did their part by separating children from their families, language, culture, parenting skills, and land knowledge, and returning them to community as traumatized strangers. Sorry, that got me there for a minute. While imperial collections seized, hoarded, and displayed Indigenous belongings as the spoils of invasion, settler museums preferred to humiliate, confuse, and quell to keep us from active dissent, from remembering and resisting dispossession. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. It's important to have some sense, though, of how Native people experience museums as not just complicit with settler colonial hegemony, but as one of its finest instruments. In fact, I know that museums are underfunded, messy, anxious places, offering exceptions and resistance to everything I'm said and everything I'm going to say. There was and is, for example, more admiration for Indians than I'm so far permitting, a fascination, really, that routinely troubles hegemonic displays. This desire leads to contacts, even partnerships, especially the museum's recent discovery of the Indigenous as contemporary, which necessitates the reforms we now strive to achieve. This is a painting by Neil MacLeod, a Cree scholar and linguist, and also a painter friend of mine, called Songs to Kill a Wintiko. And a Wintiko is a spirit or a real being that lurks in the forests and is a cannibal. And it's usually figured as a person who's been absorbed by consumption. They become all consumed by consuming. Nevertheless, we need to acknowledge, understand, and exercise colonialism's hungry ghosts, Windigos that crave and keep us from this future. A primary method for the cultural and intellectual disenfranchisement of Aboriginal people was the training of Indian experts. Not Indians as experts, but settlers who became experts in Indians. Before invasion, of course, we were our own authors and authorities. The rise of the white Indian expert required not only the separation of Aboriginal people from their better belongings, but also the transfer of knowledge from brown bodies to white. Experts of these new resources mined meaning from the Aboriginal makers and keepers. They hunted for stories, the remaining property these people had to trade for their very survival. Indian experts then set these edited things and meanings within their own worldview, casting them either akin or alien in relation to their center. Colonial museums established white European masculine values and bodies at the hub of this new entity called human, or just man, and the Aboriginal, among many others, were placed in relative orbit depending on how much humanity they had, as determined by these human experts. As a man of the cloth, George MacDougall knew what he was doing. He was waging spiritual war, saving souls from their imperfect cages and erroneous faiths. Before sending the Manitu Stone east, he sent it to Lac St. Anne, the site of the region's most important Catholic mission. The lake is about 100 kilometers from Fort Edmonton and was known to the Cree as Manitu Skakhagigan, the Lake of the Spirit. One story goes that when Hudson's Bay Company came, thinking the lake spirit, they heard it was a lake with a spirit in it, they thought it was a monster, so they called it Devil's Lake. However, the Nakota called it Wakami, or God's Lake. In 1844, Father Jean-Baptiste Thibault founded the first Catholic mission there to serve the Catholic Métis and convert the local First Nations. The lake was already sacred to the Cree when the Catholics appropriated and renamed it in honor of St. Anne. This place attracts thousands since 1889, and the lake has been a site of annual pilgrimage for Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, and Métis. And I've been there several times as a youth and then an adult, brought my own kids. And while the services are recognizable to Roman Catholics, the site appropriates numerous Indigenous spiritual practices. In fact, you You wander out. What they're doing now is, it's sort of like a baptism, but you wander out and there's a special rock there. It's a very shallow lake, and you're trying to find the rock. You stand there and you say a prayer. Why did MacDougall bring the Manitu Stone to Manitu Stone? Did he try to harness the sacred or symbolic power as Thibault did with the lake? My feeling is that this was his intent, but the stone was too powerful to be appropriated. His remaining option was to banish it. He sent it thousands of kilometers east to Toronto's Royal Ontario Museum. Removing the stone from the site of its meaning was devastating, but MacDougall's ontological transformation of the object from a sacred to the scientific, from a stone to a rock, was diabolical. To geologists, a rock is a mineral aggregate existing in nature. Stones are the same material, but altered by people. Stone walls are made from rocks. Stones are rocks altered by human hands and intention. We refer to the Stone Age rather than the Rock Age as a way of indicating a tool-making era. Rocks pressed into human service become Stonehenge rather than Rockhenge. A rock garden is an arrangement of stone trying to pass for nature. Asini, stone, indicates a difference from mere rocks, but unusually this one also has a name, Manitu. Naming is one of the most significant symbolic acts we engage in. Names confer or recognize special status. Philosopher Arthur Danto explains, for example, that one of the very few things that separate works of art from other things is a title. Artworks are entitled to titles, and mere real things are not. Names also suggest metaphysical qualities. We name our pets, but the same animal in the lab gets a number. Animals we eat also go unnamed, unstoried. That this intergalactic grandfather has a name, the highest name, Papamiha, Manitu, means that it ranks very high in an Aboriginal ontology. By spiriting away the Manitu to a museum, MacDougall wanted to strip it of its context, name, and meaning, desacralize it, convert it into a scientific object, an exceptional but mere real thing. This is the uncanniness of our presentation. We didn't talk, we don't know each other. Every culture circulates around a set of objects and spaces that are beyond property and trade. These are national treasures, sacred sites and texts, tactile symbols that are communities' gravitational center. The objects, their protection and amplification through story and touch and ritual define the society and hold its large and infinitesimal fragments together in orbit. The colonial attitude, the state of mind required to assume control over space, bodies, objects, trade, and imaginary of others, begins by refusing the living relational value of these entities. And this is done in one of two ways. Either the colonist refuses the sacred character of the thing or site because it derives from a metaphysical system that it rejects in favor of its own cosmology, or in more recent, sensitive version, materialist scholars reckon the semiotic value of sacred entities, but fail to experience their symbolic value. That is, they recognize the object's value for believers, but not for themselves. Because of their objectivist creed and position as outsiders, materialist scholars do not know the essential sacred qualities of these sacred qualities of these entities, but from within the believer's lived experience. So this was a rock, this is near where I live now, in order to give power and water to the city I live called Regina, also from the Queen. This wonderful rock here, there's a large, important story to this. This is Elder Tatusis who's protesting this. They're flooding the area. It's a huge giant lake. Why they need to blow this up, I'm not sure. But shortly after this photo was taken, they blew it up. Can't believe the same story. You can, for instance, read books about Aboriginal art by non-Indigenous writers and receive anthropological insights. learn about the history, sociology, economics, political meanings, and occasionally the aesthetics of these works, but it is rare for these authors to include, for example, subjective engagement with Aboriginal objects. Narratives about how one feels with these things, how one was, quote, moved, touched, taken to another place, momentarily born again, as Bell Hooks describes the aesthetic experience, are either not included because not experienced, or more likely excluded because these confessions lie outside of the objectivist discourse of these disciplined texts. Such writing keeps the first person, the author, at a distance from the First Nations artwork. Bell Hooks considers the failure of white critics to appreciate the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat's art and says, if they are, quote, unmoved, they are unable to speak meaningfully about the work, which is the opposite of a Kantian thought. The elusive meanings she alludes to are those felt values, communal affects, and metaphysical knowing that lie beyond objectivist discourse. When the metaphysical qualities of sacred objects are actively unrecognized as essential properties, then suddenly they become mere things and then are available for appropriation. In the case of the Manitu Stone, the Indigenous spiritual narrative was degraded, and another one, science, takes over, restoring the being as a thing. Desacralized, the medicine bundle, mask, song, story, sacred stone, and territory all become mere real things that have ascertainable market value or academic worth. The paintings you see are mine. Although the alchemy of the colonial imagination, sorry, I have to get a drink here. Through the alchemy of the colonial imagination, combined with the threat of brute force, sacred and cultural objects are transmogrified into commodities. They become, in the capitalist materialist ontology and economy, raw materials whose particular characteristics are sublimated into a higher, refined form called capital. This is the narrative that allowed, for example, sacred Inca belongings to be melted for their gold value. But colonialism also includes the idea of art and the idea of artifact. By art and artifact, I mean the modernist sense of objects having universal values that eclipse the local value. The story is that some handmade things exceed the tribe and people who made them. They are expressions of human genius and therefore belong to all of humankind. These things must be liberated from their original makers and keepers because they don't really recognize their full value. They are collected and administered only by experts properly trained in the correct humanist tradition. The desire of the colonist is directed not just at appropriating these material things, but to displacing their symbolic value and displacing living Aboriginal Indigenous people as experts and keepers of their own culture. This decontextualization erodes native cultures by moving sites of Aboriginal creativity and authentication into the colonial museum, university, book, internet, and non-native body. The return of the Manitu Stone to its homeland in 1972, but not to the care of its original keepers as a sacred object, but to the custody of the provincial museum and as a geological specimen, was a provocation. If no one complained, it meant the work of erasure and re-education was effective. People had forgotten their history. And if Aboriginal people did know what the stone was, and they also knew what the gesture meant, it was a dare to complain, to risk exposure and rebuke. So my dad remained subdued, but discontent by his sublimation. Of course, things are different now. We are, I hope, in the sticky transition between the colonial and non-colonial eras. I use the word non-colonial to distinguish our work from the logical impossibility that is decolonialism or post-colonialism in territories in which the descendants of non-Aboriginal invaders still rule over natives. Decolonial theory may make sense in places that have actually shed their colonizers, but if in New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, What is done in the name of decolonization and reconciliation is not premised on the restoration of native land and sovereignty. These words and activities are smokescreens concealing the machinery of assimilation. They are in an effort, reconciliation is an effort to make settlers more comfortable with their inherited crimes and privileges. To repurpose Richard Bell, decolonization, it's a white thing. Reconciliation, it's a white thing. The children of colonizers, now settler colonialists, need new stories in order to live with themselves and to land our territories. And these stories cannot be like the old stories, which were laid like blankets on the blood-stained earth. Science stories, anthropology, ethnology, all constituted a seemingly humane but pernicious form of invasion, slow, controlled, and less visible than the bloody violences of the great-grandfathers. You can read the giddy excitement in the written voices of settlers when individual First Peoples adopted Western clothing, words, and religions, and the sadness when they did it imperfectly, and the incredulity when they would not take the European yoke, did not become bettered in the proper way, when education did not entirely kill the Indian and the man. Aboriginals who did not assimilate or remained too dark became scapegoats, the foils of civilization. Settlers need narratives that acknowledge their ancestors' crimes, apologize for their horrible histories, if they are to make their presence ethically tolerable. You can't look your grandkids in the eyes and enjoy the land and its spoils without a good story. But we need something more. We are all stirring to the complexity of our inheritances, feeling the blood seep through the blankets. It's time to try something new, narratives and relationships that understand Aboriginals as hosts and settlers as guests. Before concluding with the last chapter in the life of the Manitu Stone and some descriptions of non-colonial keeping houses, I need to take a slight detour because when I was invited to speak, I was asked to share my thoughts about the rise of the Indigenous as a new mode of being Native. You may have noticed that I have mostly resisted the word Indigenous in favor of the academically unfashionable Aboriginal. That is because I see Aboriginal as a colonial form of being. Indigenous is the expression of the desire for a non-colonial form. So let me explain. I am Métis. We descend from the union of First Nations women and European men, mostly or overwhelmingly French and Scottish, and then from Métis interunions and other métissage. Not all mixed blood people are Métis. Most are status or non-status First Nations or are settler assimilated. Métis descend from families who lived on the northern plains and woodlands of Turtle Mountain for generations before the founding of Canada. The Métis saw themselves and were recognized by their First Nations cousins as a separate people. For our flashy clothes, we were known as the flower bead people. Acknowledging our independence, the Cree called us Opmisak, the people who own themselves. In the late 1800s, after armed resistances at Red River and Betosh, and through a type of treaty that included reparations for expropriated land, Métis were partially recognized by the Canadian state before they were dispossessed. When the Constitution was repatriated in 1982, we were formally acknowledged along with First Nations Inuit as an Aboriginal people. Oh, how did I go there? No, we'll keep that one up. I first came to Australia in 2008 when the Canada Council for the Arts sent a delegation of First Nations and Métis curators to the Sydney Biennale. The conversations I had, not only with Aboriginal artists and curators from this territory and from Australia, but also from other parts of Turtle Island, changed my life. I became Indigenous. I return at least once a year for more biennials, curatorial, and writing projects to hear and give talks to participate in the Indigenous. In my experience, Indigenous and Aboriginal are not synonyms. My primary identity, for example, is Métis. I am part of a family that belongs to a culture and territory within the Métis homeland. My responsibilities include chairing the shared management board of the Betosh site, one of our most important historical and spiritual places. And much of my art is committed to extending Métis visual and material culture into the contemporary moment. If I were less preoccupied with indigeneity, I would live a traditional Métis community I would learn to jig, play the fiddle, hunt, and speak our language, Michif. I also aligned myself with First Nations people from other territories across the country now known as Canada, and I'm recognized by them not only as Métis, but as Aboriginal. Aboriginal is a second characteristic, a political identity formed in response to colonization. When individual bands recognized they had more in common with each other than with the settlers, they formed intertribal treaties, the Iroquois Confederacy, later the Six Nations Confederacy, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and so on. They became Aboriginal. When individual First Nations and Métis locals are centered on specific territories, while individual First Nations and Métis locals are centered on specific territories, Aboriginality is more abstract and a more mobile set of relationships and agreements. The powwow circuit is Aboriginal. Indigenous is a relatively new category of being. This tertiary identity consists of Aboriginal people who ally with other Aboriginal people from around the world, especially those with a common original colonizer, say the British. Indigenous is a discursive and contingent space characterized by mobile relations enabled and maintained virtually through the internet, telephone, reading and writing, etc. And physically, thanks to rapid and for some, cheap travel. Prior to being offered the privilege of travel, of being brought to Australia by the Canada Council, I was, and actually really remain, a regional person. I had not ventured beyond the prairies where my life, work, and art are centered. That trip opened me to new relationships, places, and modes of being. Every Indigenous person is Aboriginal and a member of a First Nation, tribe, local, Métis local, iwi, or what have you. However, not all tribal people are Aboriginal or Indigenous. While our primary social identities are due to birth or adoption, being Indigenous is a choice and privilege accorded to few. Of the three broad native lifeways, the tribal or national is most tied to land and language. Aboriginality is in relation to country, but people living in Aboriginal life tend to spend most of their time in cities and in motion. The Indigenous condition is at the moment the least grounded, exists in placeless spaces, conferences, international residencies, art fairs, exhibitions, studios, and universities, in transit spaces, in books, over phones, and online. Well, that's the one that should have come up earlier. Last January, Candace Hopkins, who's Tlingit, and I led an international residency at the Banff Centre for the Arts. In one of our circles, Salate Tuali, a Fijian artist living in Sydney, remarked on how strange it was that she had to come to Banff to have a conversation that she should be having at home. Freed from having to translate and explain ourselves to non-Indigenous others, we can get on with deepening our identities and projects. In Indigenous space, we can be critical without being adversarial. Most Aboriginal and tribal politics are in suspense in Indigenous spaces. The great weakness of the Indigenous, however, is if it becomes unmoored from the identities, people, territories, and knowledge that grounds it. The Indigenous can be a cog easily slipped into the mainstream meaning-making machine. The Indigenous must always be humbled by the Aboriginal, the tribal, and country. That ends the detour back to the non-colonial. This is my friend Joseph Netahau. He's a Cree storyteller and linguist. Non-colonial action means learning and using, but not getting subsumed by, anti-colonial critique. Non-colonial action is productive work, the recovery and restoration of native languages and territories, modes of knowing and being prior to contact. However, it also recognizes adaptation as a fundamental quality of being native. We have the right to be contemporary, to adapt, to be Indigenous without sacrificing our heritage and country. Non-colonial activity is centered on First Nations separatism. However, it can include shared spaces in which the Indigenous is centered. Such spaces are possible when the narratives that sustain settler colonialism are recognized, felt, known to be incredible and unsustainable. I take as axiomatic that the patriarchal, capitalist, and racist histories, habits, and ideas that we clot under the words Western and colonial has the nature of an illness, and that native ways of knowing and being are medicines, antidotes for this disorder. We, native and not, are compelled to center the Aboriginal Indigenous, not out of guilt, deference, or an expression of multicultural inclusion, and not only because it's the right, the just thing to do, but because we recognize it as a better way of knowing and being in these territories, more healthful than dominant culture habits that humiliate the native, dehumanize the majority, and degrade the ecosphere. Let's consider one symptom. Colonial museums are becoming hoards. A hoard is a mass of things collected and secreted away by people who feel the objects are valuable. They get a feeling of power from the piles, even when the hoard has little meaning or value for others. Eventually, the stacks have lives of their own. They become pernicious beings that distort the hoarders' lives and the lives of the hoard's inheritors. Problems arise when the reason for collecting, the precipitating ontology, takes second place to maintaining the hoard. Or trouble grows in the other direction when the will that directs the collecting and collection becomes compulsive and moribund and overwhelms the needs of the living. Finally, the cancerous collection puts so much stress on its container such that few new things can be added. Such a hoard embodies the will of an ancestor and chokes the lives of the living. Such a museum is a necropolis, a city for the dead. Non-colonial museums are based on Indigenous ontologies. They respect the ancestors, the healthy ones, who guide us, but we do not suffer the dead weight of the ill ones who desire corporeal immortality. The happy dead want to be remembered, wish their collective wisdom and stories to live, but they do not mean to burden us with their things, their individual desires made concrete. When the Imperial Museum collects to prove, while the Imperial Museum collects to prove dominion, colonial museums, that is a museum on Indigenous territory made by settlers for settlers, a hoard is a proof of presence. Their piles are tent pegs, creating a feeling of weight, attempting to secure their contingent occupation. Indigenous people who are at home with the land are in less need of such piles, property, and proofs. We traverse lightly. Our presence is storied in and with our country, our reservoir of being and meaning. Hoarding is an unhealthy emotional attachment to material things. It's an illness of colonial capitalism. Perhaps settler psychology is such that people project on things as if they were empty vessels and cannot let them go because they identify with them in a non-critical, non-relational way. Indigenous people of the plains do not hoard because they were mobile, and were mobile because they did not hoard. Because plains people know everything as animate, their decision is not to inanimate things, but with animate relations. People in the Indigenous mode recognize things as animate relations rather than possessions, not possessing and possessed by. Museums then are non-colonial, are indigenized when they place the needs of living people before preserved possessions. When they recognize that the inherited hoards are not inanimate things, but desires made firm, and some of those desires are healthier than others. Some need curatorial care, others need to be released. My final point is that the non-colonial collaboration is a partnership in which both parties and the systems they represent are disturbed by the encounter. Most Indigenous settler encounters are characterized by unequal power relations and results. Too often, non-Aboriginal experts consult with Aboriginals as subjects rather than as Indigenous peers. To be non-colonial is to defer to living Aboriginal people in tribal matters. However, to be Indigenous is to consider non-Aboriginal modes and tools and see if they might be made Indigenous. Non-colonial collaborations are characterized by respectful trying. Under paradigms still entangled in colonial habits, museums thought they were catalysts. A catalyst precipitates a change, but is itself unchanged. Non-colonialism requires better metaphors to inspire better results. Almost done. The Manitu Stone was never owned and it wasn't kept by anyone. Like the land it rested on, all shared it. It just lay in a field where it fell. People visited it. No one conceived the stone as property and so could not imagine its theft. It took a different imaginary, an alien narrative, to reconceive the stone as geology and abduct it with a clear conscience. Today, things are different. The museum recognizes that their foundational narratives regarding First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people are incredible and need revision. In 1997, the Royal Alberta Museum listened and moved the Manitu Stone from their geology department to their Aboriginal gallery. This dramatic change in imaginary signaled to Native people that the museum was no longer under the thrall of its colonial ancestors. Those like my father who were silenced saw that they now could be heard in these spaces, and almost immediately people came forward and demanded the Manitu Stone be returned. But to which nation? Chris Robinson, executive director of the museum, recently explained, "We recognize that it certainly isn't ours." So we consulted 30 First Nations. Most objected to it going to any one nation. Victor Steinhauer, the president of the Blue Quills First Nations College in St. Paul, Alberta. St. Paul is actually St. Paul de Métis, where our family was moved after we were rousted from Edmonton. So he consulted 30 First Nations, and Vincent Steinhauer said, "One thing the elders in the consultation were very clear about was that the stone belongs to all First Nations, not to one. It's not property. That's why there has been no resolution about where we'd like it returned." The museum is closed and we will reopen in a new location next year. All the displays are being rethought, and I'm told that an Indigenous display will reflect the knowledge and needs of a powerful Indigenous curatorial and community consultation committee. The best option so far has been an idea that's come from the consultations, and the idea is that the stone should remain in the museum, but housed in a special room suitable for ceremonies. I found this remarkable. I found this video online just yesterday. This is Rob Cardinal. He's a Siksika, that's a Blackfoot, Southern Alberta, and he's an astronomer, and he was visiting the stone. And he's doing this regular interview. He doesn't tell the history. It's not a secret, but he doesn't tell the history at all, doesn't reveal it. And then he starts talking to the stone, which was what was done. It was pretty impressive. So most Indigenous people involved in repatriation agree that bodies and recognized sacred objects should be returned to community and sometimes to the earth. But many also agree that some things are best cared for in museums, especially when it includes Indigenous stewardship. While I am personally interested in sovereign Indigenous display territories, there are objects, relations, and moments such as these where an international collaboration is the best solution. Thank you very much.